Chapter 13. The Conversion. This is not a time of gentleness, of timid beginnings. It is a time for loud-voiced, open speech and fearless thinking, a time of all that is robust and vehement and bold. I love it, for it thrills me and gives me a feeling that I shall face great and terrible things. Helen wrote these stirring phrases for a New York socialist newspaper, The Call, and they can be taken as a declaration of how she intended to live the rest of her life. She made speeches, gave interviews, wrote articles. The language she used in them was outspoken, often reckless. She seemed to be challenging people to see her in a different light now, no longer the student rising gallantly above her limitations, but part of the active, tumultuous world. She longed to experience danger, preferably in the service of some noble cause, and socialism was the cause she chose, partly because it was an increasingly popular movement. There were other reasons as well. Vast personal fortunes were typical of the period, one that historians refer to as the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, was a prime example. In 1900, his annual income was over $23 million, tax-free, since there was no income tax. The average wage of all American workers was then between $400 and $500 a year. Most big industries were not yet unionized, and people worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. A worker injured in a factory or mine got no compensation from his employer, not even when the injury prevented him from ever working again. In the 1890s, there had been about 1,000 strikes a year nationwide. In 1904, there were 4,000. The socialist idea, the one put forward by the recently formed Socialist Party of America, was that competition must be replaced by cooperation, that profit-seeking must give way to social service, and that the result would be a narrowing of the great gap between the haves and have-nots. Some socialists were radical, as John Macy was. Others, like Helen, were moderate, even conservative. Helen spoke about her conversion to socialism and explained it as brought about by books that John had lent her. But Helen had never needed converting. Emotionally, she had been a socialist since adolescence when she visited the foul-smelling slums of New York. She was reminded of her hopeless and powerless existence as a child. Annie had come to her rescue, and generous friends paid for her education. Surely it was just and fair and right that others should be helped the way she had been helped. Factory girls in New York, lumberjacks in the piney woods, railroad workers, coal miners. When they went out on strike, in her mind's eyes, Helen marched alongside them. Annie had no interest in socialism. She had no interest either in women's suffrage, feminism, or any system based on the belief that the human race could improve itself. John did his best to change her mind. They argued, sometimes noisily and in public, but Annie refused to be converted, and Helen's conversion was still a personal matter, one the world knew nothing about. The household had been having money troubles for some time. The fund that supported Helen and Annie at Wrentham came from rich people, capitalists who considered socialism about as desirable as smallpox. This fund had dwindled somewhat since Annie's marriage. The two women knew little about business matters, and all their investments were apparently harebrained. John, whose income was modest, was something of a spendthrift, and Annie worried herself sick about his unpaid bills at St. Botolph, his Boston club. Perhaps they should move to Maine, where living was cheaper. Then another solution arrived in Helen's mail, an offer of $5,000 a year for life, no strings attached. It came from Andrew Carnegie. With his wife, he administered the Carnegie pensions, which helped support men and women who made outstanding contributions to public life. Helen declined. As a socialist, she felt she could hardly accept a gift from such a man, but she did it gracefully, charmingly, in a letter that said nothing about socialism. It was only in the winter of 1910, Helen's 30th year, that she was ready for a public declaration. She made it in the form of a letter that was sent with a check to the socialist newspaper, Appeal to Reason. Fred Warren, the Appeal's editor, had been jailed by a federal court for sending scurrilous, defamatory, and threatening material through the mail. Helen's letter pointed out that the U.S. Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech and of the press. Therefore, it didn't take a socialist to realize it wasn't Mr. Warren, but the federal judges themselves who ought to be in jail for abridging a constitutional right. I learn that our physicians are making great progress in the cure and prevention of blindness, she said. What surgery of politics, what antiseptic of common sense and right thinking shall be applied to cure the blindness of our judges? This was the new Helen, denouncing federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the letter was published, her capitalist friends were stunned. So were her mother and Mildred. Helen hung a large red flag, the symbol of socialism, in the window of her bedroom at Wrentham. She had a reader come in regularly to read to her from the International Socialist Review. And in Schenectady, New York, a newly elected socialist mayor, George Lunn, pastor of the First Reformed Church, needed an executive secretary and offered the post to John Macy. John accepted. Helen and Annie spoke about following him in the autumn. When this news reached Schenectady, it produced unexpected results. The local press announced "Noted Blind Girl Coming with Macy," with a subhead declaring that the new secretary was going to bring a famous young woman to Schenectady to live. Next, the mayor announced the establishment of a board of public welfare. He would appoint Miss Keller to it when she came. Newspapers all over the country then seized upon Helen's forthcoming entrance into politics. They wanted statements, interviews. She told a reporter that her life had only just begun. All the rest that has gone before has been as nothing, only the merest preparation, the getting ready to do really great things that shall perhaps help all mankind. Newspaper columns bubbled with Helen Keller in Schenectady throughout the summer. One paper, the anti-socialist Common Cause, found the subject distasteful. It would be difficult to imagine anything more pathetic than the present exploitation of poor Helen Keller by the socialists of Schenectady, it said. And according to the Brooklyn Eagle, Helen Keller's mistaken ideas spring out of the manifest limitations of her development. With the exception of the Call, the attitude of most newspapers to Helen's socialism was equally cruel. She was pitiful, pathetic, limited, exploited by others, they said, meaning she was a non-person. If they expected that she would be crushed into silence by this treatment, they were wrong. Helen replied to the Eagle in a style that was tart and good-humored and very much of her own. "Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle, what an ungallant bird it is! When it fights back, let it fight fair. Let it attack my ideas and oppose the aims and arguments of socialism. It is not fair fighting or good argument to remind me and others that I cannot see or hear. I can read. I can read all the socialist books I have time for in English, German, and French." Because their money problems were still unsolved, Helen had been taking voice lessons again in the hope of doing a lecture tour. The women were less than enthusiastic about Schenectady. Even John was restless and dissatisfied there, unsure how long he wanted to stay. Annie, in her mid-40s now, had gained so much weight in recent years that she could only be described as portly. She was moody and depressed, often physically exhausted, and had lost all hope of having a baby. Suddenly, that September, Annie was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in Brookline for major surgery. The nature of this surgery is unclear, but for a time there was serious concern for her life, and even when it was clear that she would survive, the Wrentham family was told to expect a long convalescence. John resigned his job to be with his wife. Helen went to friends in Washington, where she wrote to Annie every day and begged for news of home. She wrote to John as well, asking about the world of labor. Was the Lawrence strike still on? "Please, please don't throw me out of it all. It makes me too homesick." A strike of factory workers in the Massachusetts town of Lawrence had filled newspaper columns worldwide. When the strike leaders were jailed, members of a militant union called the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, otherwise known as Wobblies, stepped in to take their places. They believed in such tactics as boycotts, mass demonstrations, and sabotage. John was an outspoken supporter. Sometime later, Annie was now convalescing at Wrentham with Helen at her side. Helen decided that she too was a wobbly. The IWW had called a strike against knitting mills in Little Falls, New York, and she sent them a check for $87.50 with a letter of encouragement that was read aloud to an enthusiastic strike rally. Even Annie, the least political of people, had been so moved by the Lawrence strike that she too became a socialist. Many of the wobbly leaders were invited to Wrentham, including William Big Bill Haywood, the one-eyed firebrand, and Arturo Giovannitti, a handsome young poet. For Helen, having these people in her home was as close as she could get to all that was robust and vehement and bold. The Wobblies and the Lawrence strike had another meaning for her. They had converted Annie to socialism. Annie and John were on the same side now. A barrier between them had vanished, and John could reach out to Annie, embracing her as his comrade and beloved. Or so it seemed to Helen, who had suspected for some time that their marriage was in trouble. John helped with plans for the lecture tour, the one Helen and her voice coach had been working up to. It was John who chose the first performance hall and decided how much to charge for tickets. The wording of the speeches was also partly his, and in February 1913 Annie and Helen made their first public appearance in the auditorium of a high school in Montclair, New Jersey, with the Montclair branch of the Socialist Party as their sponsor. At least one of her many biographers believes it was also Helen's first public appearance after an operation that replaced her eyes with artificial ones. Until then, she had always insisted on being photographed in profile because her eyes were uneven in size, but from then on she would often be photographed full face. In any case, it was a very public appearance and understandably frightening, since she was to stand before people who had paid not only to see her, but to hear her. Terror invaded my flesh, Helen said later. My mind froze, my heart stopped beating. Desperately I prayed as the moment approached to go out before the audience. Oh God, let me pour out my voice freely. Until my dying day I shall think of that stage as a pillory where I stood cold, riveted, trembling, voiceless. She survived that first speech and went on to make others. In time a routine evolved. The first part was Annie's. She spoke for about an hour, telling the story of how she taught the wild creature who was Helen at the age of 7. When it was Helen's turn to go on, someone brought her out to the platform. Placing her fingers on Annie's mouth, she showed the audience the art of lip reading. Then she gave a short talk, usually a series of inspirational statements full of hope and good counsel. Her voice was never easy to follow. Some people described it as high-pitched, with a peculiar metallic ring, but no harder to understand than the speech of a foreigner with a heavy accent. Others called it grotesque. The next part consisted of questions from the audience. Why was Miss Keller wearing a red dress when she looked so well in white? How could she tell day from night? Which part of her brain did she think with? Was it true she could sing and play the piano and tell when it was going to rain? From start to finish, the performance lasted about 2 hours. In April 1913, Helen and Teacher were in Maine for a lecture when the weather turned suddenly cold, and Teacher collapsed in their hotel room with the flu. Only moments before, Helen had been a confident, capable woman, doing work she was well paid for. Now she was helpless, unable to use the phone because she was deaf, unable to grope her way out of the room because she had never been in it before. Her helplessness was terrifying to her. Teacher finally pulled herself together and phoned a doctor. They got to the train station, came home to Wrentham, and within days Helen wrote to Andrew Carnegie saying she was ready to accept the financial assistance he offered. His reply was prompt and wonderfully kind. He sent a check that was the first of many, for the Carnegie pension lasted the rest of Helen's life. When John Macy sailed for Europe a month later, his holiday was partly underwritten by one of America's greatest capitalists. What happened in Maine would happen again, and they knew it. They would have to find a secretary, an aide of some sort, for Teacher's vision was deteriorating, and her general health was not good. They made inquiries, but found nobody willing to work as hard as they did. Meanwhile, John wrote to them at Wrentham, and they wrote to John, and when he came home at the end of the summer, he was drinking heavily. The women signed a contract with the Pond Lecture Bureau and began a tour of eastern cities. Instead of staying in Wrentham, John found an apartment in Boston. It was one more step in the dismantling of the marriage. Then in January 1914, Helen, Annie, and Kate set off on their first transcontinental lecture tour, speaking in halls and big noisy tents full of country people at a camp on the edge of a lake. Helen kept John informed in letters that were loving and cheerful. His replies, however, were addressed to Kate, and they were bitter. Annie nagged, he said. Annie tried to influence Helen against him. Annie insisted on centering the life of the household around Helen, and was never a wife to him, never did any of the things a woman might be expected to do. Annie dominated Helen. Helen wrote back imploring him to be calm, fair, kind. All three of the women went from city to city, hotel to hotel, carrying with them the misery of this dying marriage. There were other causes for alarm. By August of that year, Europe was at war, Germany and Austro-Hungary against an alliance led by Russia, France, and Great Britain. President Woodrow Wilson urged Americans to remain neutral in thought and deed, but for Helen, neutrality was not possible. How could she remain neutral on the subject of Russia, whose ruler was a tyrant and a murderer of Jews? As for Great Britain, in Helen's opinion, that country had built an empire by pushing her conquests to the ends of the earth, strewing her path with blood, tears, and untold crimes. The European war oppressed her spirits, so did the very real possibility that America would abandon neutrality, becoming a partner with England and Russia in the destruction of civilization. She took these concerns with her when setting out on a second transcontinental tour early in 1915. Luckily for Helen and Annie, they also took with them a new immigrant from Scotland, a young woman named Polly Thompson, who became their assistant, secretary, and loyal friend. Chapter 14. In the Thick of It. The lectures were a huge success. Crowds of people came, including Thomas Edison, former President William Howard Taft, and the great tenor Enrico Caruso, who sang to Helen while she listened with her fingertips. When she lectured in Detroit, it was Henry Ford himself who escorted her on a tour of his factory. But when they returned to Wrentham, the house seemed empty without John's presence. Helen longed for him, for the sweetness of family life they had once had, the evenings when he read from the newspaper, explaining the world to her. There was so much she wanted to talk over with him now, ideas, events, and most of all the war. A British passenger ship, Lusitania, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland by a German submarine. More than 1,000 passengers were lost, among them 128 Americans. In the wake of this tragedy, President Wilson's position shifted from neutrality to preparedness for war. Although public feeling was actively against Germany, there was no appetite for war, and the country resisted preparedness. Helen was against both preparedness and war, as John was. Both of them thought that soldiers in the trenches overseas would have to end the war themselves by putting their guns down. But if their thoughts were parallel, there was hardly any contact between them now. Between Annie and John there was even less, and yet Annie thought of him constantly. Her suffering during those days was almost more than Helen could bear. She kept demanding Helen's love in a way that was heartbreaking. Helen said for days she would shut herself up, almost stunned, trying to think of a plan that would bring John back, or weeping as only women who are no longer cherished weep. She was too reserved to show her grief openly, and she refused to be comforted. To no one except myself in the silence of the night did she speak of her anguish or the terrible dreams that pursued her. Annie's vision had deteriorated so badly that she could no longer read, and she could no longer take any kind of exercise because of her weight. She was almost 50 and surely facing blindness within the next 10 years, a prospect that terrified her. She would not live blind, she told Helen. She would rather take her own life. Yet Annie was equally determined that nothing should interfere with the active, useful life Helen was entitled to, a life very much in the spotlight now. In December 1915, Helen agreed to talk about prospects for peace at a meeting sponsored by the Labor Forum. It would take place at Washington Irving High School in New York City, and she let it be known that she intended to advocate a general strike as the surest way to end the European war. Although local newspapers sent up a howl of protest, an audience of more than 2,000 came to hear her. With Annie translating, Helen denounced preparedness as a scheme of the capitalist class for the further enslavement of workers. This brought cheering and wild applause that she felt as vibrations. Let no working men join this army which Congress is trying to build up. Only munitions makers and bankers like J.P. Morgan had anything to gain from preparedness, she said. More applause. I hold true patriotism to be the brotherhood and mutual service of all men. The preparedness, I believe, in is right thinking, efficiency, knowledge, and courage to follow the highest ideals. When it was over, Helen found an enthusiastic mob waiting for her on the sidewalk and a police escort ready to take her to her car. Seizing the moment, she delivered another speech right there on the sidewalk. The following day, the New York Herald wrote, "Nobody can have the heart to criticize poor little Helen Keller for talking when opportunity offers. Talking is to her a newly discovered art, and it matters not if she does talk of things concerning which she knows nothing, could not possibly know anything." But New York City as a whole, with its sizable immigrant communities where the socialist faith prevailed, was on fire with enthusiasm for Helen Keller. They wanted another chance to hear her, and the Labor Forum and the Women's Peace Party joined together to hire Carnegie Hall for a second speech. Again, she was rash, defiant, and received with wild enthusiasm. A month later, Helen gave an interview to a reporter from the New York Tribune, a woman who noted that Miss Keller was having her nails manicured while they spoke. Anyone who still thought of her as a disembodied spirit was about to learn otherwise. The reporter went on. She wore elegant clothes. She insisted on having her nails and hair done, even for the smallest of small towns, and in spite of her peculiar speech, she said what she wanted to, amazing her friends, her family, and sometimes even her teacher. It is here and now, the reporter began, that Helen Keller, miracle among blind women, makes her debut as an IWW. The Socialist Party was too slow, Miss Keller said. It was sinking in the political bog. This was the reason she had become a wobbly. Several friends who were present declared themselves shocked by the statement that Miss Keller was a wobbly. They implored the reporter not to print it, implored Miss Keller to retract. It would create a sensation, they said. It would ruin her for further peace work. Miss Keller told them, "I don't give a damn about semi-radicals." She was a fighter now, she said. She would willingly go to jail to uphold her views. In other interviews, Helen described John D. Rockefeller as a monster of capitalism, while Theodore Roosevelt, a big game hunter and the nation's leading advocate of intervention in the war, was in her opinion the most bloodthirsty man in the United States. All this newspaper coverage reached Alabama, where Kate read it and shivered. Her daughter's mindset was entirely different from her own. Although she shared Helen's strong faith in women's suffrage, in other ways Kate was very much a conservative Southerner, and the same was true of Mildred, now Miss Warren Tyson. Helen, who understood their feelings, avoided any discussion of politics when she was with them. Kate and Mildred did the same. With sufficient tact on both sides, they managed to keep the family together in spite of their differences. Unfortunately, it was also true that Kate and Mildred saw Helen as set apart from ordinary life. She was more than human, perhaps, or else imperfectly human. If Helen had told them, "I am just like you, blind and deaf, but otherwise with the same needs and hopes and emotions as yours," the words would have been meaningless to them. This lack of understanding helps to explain the next chapter in Helen's life. In the months before it begins, her energies went into the drive for women's votes. She joined the newly formed National Women's Party, a militant group that was patterned along the same lines as an English suffrage organization, one that had provoked violent police reprisals in the hope of embarrassing Parliament into doing something about women in the vote. "Rights are things that we get when we are strong enough to claim them," Helen wrote in the Call. Then it was summer, 1916, and Helen and teacher started home after a speaking tour. Since Polly was in Scotland with her dying mother, they had engaged a young man named Peter Fagan to act as their secretary. He was 29 years old, a colleague of John's on the Boston Herald, and an impassioned socialist. One newspaper referred to him as slender and fair-haired, but little is known about his background, his habits, his sense of humor, or lack of it. When the travelers came back to Wrentham, they found no sign of John, not even a message to welcome them home. Overcome with loneliness, Helen sent for her mother again. Within days of Kate's arrival, they learned that Annie had pleurisy and tenacious cough. It looked like the onset of tuberculosis, the disease that had killed her mother and Jimmy. The doctor said her best chance for survival was a sanatorium at Lake Placid, New York. When Polly returned from Scotland, it was arranged for her to go to Lake Placid with teacher, while Helen returned to Alabama in her mother's care. The two Wrentham servants, a houseman and a chauffeur, would have to find work elsewhere. The household was coming apart. Helen's world was coming apart. Exile in Alabama without teacher, without the work that gave meaning to her life, amounted to a prison sentence. How long would it last? Suppose teacher never recovered? Chapter 15. A Love Story. More than most women, Helen was born to love and be loved, and to become a loving mother of children. It came close to happening. The story of what happened instead is told almost entirely by Helen, starting with the day she faced banishment to Alabama and felt overwhelmed by a sense of her own isolation. Such was the background of the adventure I shall relate. I was sitting alone in my study one evening, utterly despondent. The young man, Peter Fagan, who was still acting as my secretary, came in and sat down beside me. For a long time he held my hand in silence. Then he began talking to me tenderly. I was surprised that he cared so much about me. There was sweet comfort in his loving words. He was full of plans for my happiness. He said if I would marry him, he would always be near to help me in the difficulties of life. He would be there to read to me, look up material for my books, and do as much as he could of the work my teacher had done for me. His love was a bright sun that shone upon my helplessness and isolation. The sweetness of being loved enchanted me, and I yielded to an imperious thought to be a part of a man's life. For a brief space I danced in and out of the gates of heaven. She was eager to tell her mother and teacher about the wonder of it, but Peter Fagin knew it would not be simple. Better wait a bit, he said. We must tell them together. We must try to realize what their feelings will be. Certainly they will disapprove at first. Her mother had never liked him, possibly because she believed he intensified Helen's radicalism, and teacher, obsessed by her illness and the loss of John, hardly thought about Peter Fagin at all. He had learned both Braille and the manual language, and their lecture agent considered him a first-class secretary, but in teacher's opinion he wasn't worth taking seriously. So there were reasons for waiting. He promised Helen he would win her mother's approval by his devotion. As for teacher, she was too ill to be excited just now. In the meanwhile, the two young people walked together in the beauty of the autumn woods, and Peter read to Helen a great deal. They must have behaved the way sweethearts behave, because both the servants, the houseman, and the chauffeur watched them from a distance, and knew they were in love. The secrecy was troubling to Helen. Teacher would be leaving for Lake Placid in a day or so, and after that it would be too late to tell her. One evening Helen made up her mind to speak to teacher the next morning. But the next morning fate took matters into her own hands, Helen tells us. She was dressing, full of the excitement of what she had to communicate, and unaware that the Boston Globe carried a story about someone called Peter Fagin, who had applied for a license to marry Helen Keller. The bedroom door burst open and Kate flew in. She held the morning paper with her hands shaking, and her movements felt harsh and hostile. What have you been doing with that creature? The papers are full of a dreadful story about you and him. What does it all mean? Tell me. Helen went on brushing her hair, pretending at first not to know what her mother was talking about. Are you engaged to him? Did you apply for a marriage license? Still brushing her hair, still outwardly cool and composed, Helen was terribly frightened. She never says what she was frightened of, or how a mother could prevent a 36-year-old daughter from marrying if she chose to. She knew only that she had to protect Peter and therefore denied everything. She even lied to teacher and did it so well that teacher believed her. My mother ordered the young man out of the house that very day, Helen's account continues. She would not even let him speak to me, but he wrote me a note in Braille telling me where he would be and begging me to keep him informed. In the Boston Globe, Helen Keller and the secretary vehemently deny they are to be wed. Call story and outrage. Although Helen had indeed written a denial, she and Peter had made arrangements to meet again. Teacher and Polly left for Lake Placid. Kate and Helen had been planning to travel by boat to Savannah, then by train to Montgomery, Alabama, where Kate was living with the Tysons. According to headlines in the Boston Post, Helen Keller's romance fades, reported fiancé quits as secretary and goes south, denying engagement. May wed later, despite opposition. How were they to wed later? It seems that Peter and Helen had arranged for Peter to board the Savannah-bound boat, and in the interval between the boat and the train the two of them would escape to Florida. A minister friend of his would marry them there. Somehow Kate found this out in time to change the itinerary. Mother and daughter left Wrentham by train and traveled all the way south by train. Peter sailed to Savannah alone. The journey to Alabama must have been heartbreaking for Helen, imagining what might have been, playing over in her mind how close they came to escape, and an end to loneliness. Why had she let it happen? She thought of herself as determined, as a person who knew what she wanted and went after it. Yet she had submitted herself like a child to the will of a stubborn mother. I cannot account for my behavior, Helen said later. As I look back and try to understand, I am completely bewildered. I seem to have acted exactly opposite my nature. In spite of her mother's deception, they were still in touch, still planning for their future. Peter followed Helen to Montgomery. When Mildred saw them together on the porch one morning, talking, hands to hand, she went upstairs to Kate. Mildred's husband, Warren Tyson, got his gun, and the three of them ran down to the porch. Peter faced the gun courageously, saying he loved Helen and wanted to marry her, but the confrontation ended with his being run off the premises. Even then the lovers tried to keep faith. Mildred was awakened in the middle of the night by footsteps on the porch. Helen, having packed her bag, was waiting there for Peter. She waited hour after hour, but he never came. Nobody has ever said why. Helen came to think of her brief love story as a little island of joy surrounded by dark waters. Her mother must have thought of it as a lucky escape, but from what? What were her reasons for meddling, for essentially kidnapping the daughter who trusted her? A possible explanation comes from Mildred's granddaughter, Keller Johnson. She believes that both Kate and Mildred felt there was something unseemly about the marriage of a person as severely impaired Marriage meant an intimate physical relationship, and they had trouble with that. Her grandmother never said as much, Keller Johnson adds, yet she gave that impression. I am glad that I have had the experience of being loved and desired, Helen wrote. The fault was not in the loving, but in the circumstances. She was still in Montgomery, virtually imprisoned, with Peter gone from her life, and Annie gone as well for months, perhaps many months. There was no way of knowing for how long. Teacher hated every minute of her treatment in the sanatorium. The other patients were old and dull, the weather was hideously cold, and she yearned for escape. Before long she did escape, sailing with Polly for Puerto Rico. It was something done on impulse, on a moment's notice. They found a little cabin in the hills where for $15 a month the two of them set up housekeeping. Helen must join them. Kate must join them. Helen could not bring herself to make such a trip, and she suspected that in spite of all the sunny letters, Teacher was not doing so well. Suppose something happened to her. Their financial affairs were tangled. Helen had no idea how to manage them. If anything should happen to you suddenly, she wrote, to whom would you wish me to turn for help in business matters? Teacher's replies were always reassuring. She mentioned John Macy. He understands your business better than anyone else. For my own part, I think of him constantly, and since I have been ill, much of the bitterness has gone from my thoughts of him. I wish you could forgive and forget, too. You would be much happier if you could, Helen. This was one of the great differences between them, that Annie exploded but then forgave. Helen rarely forgave, especially when someone was unkind to Annie or ignored her. In their letters, discussions of money gave way to news. Helen felt almost as far removed from politics as Teacher was. She went for long walks with Mildred, shorter walks with Mildred's two little girls, whom she adored, was entertained by the ladies of Montgomery, and all the while she longed for action. The nation was on the brink of war, but the ladies of Montgomery were not interested in war. Except for Kate, they were not interested in suffrage either. Another topic Helen could not discuss in Montgomery was the treatment of blacks in the South. She had sent a check for $100 to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and with it a letter. It should bring a blush of shame to the face of every true American to know that 10 million of his countrymen are denied the equal protection of the laws. Ashamed in my very soul, I behold in my own beloved Southland the tears of those who are oppressed, those who must bring up their sons and daughters in bondage to be servants because others have their fields and vineyards, and on the side of the oppressor is power. The letter appeared in the Crisis, a publication of the NAACP, and was reprinted by the Selma Journal. A number of Helen's relatives lived in Selma, among them Cousin Layla, and they were shocked. So was much of Alabama, including editors of the Selma Journal. In an editorial, they described her letters as full of untruths, full of fawnings and bootlicking phrases. Helen kept her thoughts on this subject to herself from then on, but she felt increasingly like an exile, separated from the Women's Peace Party and from the radical suffragists of the National Women's Party, and most painfully of all, from Teacher. Then, in early April 1917, America entered the war, and Teacher and Polly came home as fast as they could. Helen and Kate went to New York to meet them. Of course, dear, life will never be just the same again for any of us, Annie had said months earlier. It never is after these great changes. We cannot expect it. The war touched every aspect of life. It clamped down on freedom of speech, on the press, on Helen's comrades among the Wobblies, and on anyone who refused to march in steps with militarism. And because the wartime rise in prices had made Wrentham too costly to run, it would have to be sold. Helen wondered how she could bear to part with the place where she, Annie, and John Macy had once been a family. Chapter 16. Lights, Camera. It was an unpopular war. The government's task was to win the country's support, which might take time, and in the meanwhile to find ways of compelling support. 1 million soldiers were needed, but in the first 6 weeks after war was declared, only 73,000 volunteered, so Congress voted for a draft. 2 months later, in June 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, which would be used to imprison those who spoke or acted against the draft on the war. The post office began taking away the mailing privileges of publications that printed anti-war articles. In Los Angeles, a movie was released that dealt with the American Revolution and showed British soldiers firing on the colonists' wives and children. The man who made the film was prosecuted for having questioned the good faith of our ally, Great Britain, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. From Russia during that eventful year came news of a socialist revolution in the making. By autumn, the socialists were replaced by the Bolsheviks, but Helen, like many others at the time, saw little difference between socialists and Bolsheviks. They were revolutionaries. They had overthrown a tyrant. They resembled her IWW comrades, Big Bill Haywood and Arturo the poet, who were sitting on the Cook County jail awaiting trial for offenses under the Espionage Act. Helen said of the Wobblies, "I love them for their needs, their miseries, their endurance, and their daring spirit." She had settled into a red brick cottage on the wrong side of the tracks in Forest Hills, New York, with Teacher and Polly, when a piece of miraculous news came to them. Annie had gone to Lake Placid to be re-examined and learned she had never had tuberculosis. Those first test results had been confused with someone else's. Now that the sword had hung over their heads had vanished, they were together again, and they expected to live very quietly from then on. 3 women, their golden Great Dane, Sieglinde, and an old friend from Cambridge days, Ned Holmes, who looked after them. Early in 1918, their quiet lives were interrupted by an offer to make Helen's life into a movie, a Hollywood movie. Silent, because all movies were silent. The offer came from a man named Francis Trevelyan Miller, who held 2 advanced degrees and was entitled to be addressed as Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller explained that the idea for this movie came to him after he read Miss Keller's autobiography and knew that her story must be told to the entire seeing world. Movies were the way to do it, for they spoke a universal language. According to government estimates, in this country alone, some 15 million people went to the movies every day. The women were thrilled and amazed and eager to learn more. Not so long before, when Helen graduated from Radcliffe, nobody went to the movies, certainly nobody they knew. Movies were just little bits of things at the time, a jittery travelogue, a fake newsreel, and a vaudeville show, the whole program lasting about a half an hour. The theater was outdoors, with wooden benches for seats, and people brought newspapers to cover their heads in case of rain. Admission was 5 cents. Now movie making was the 5th largest industry in America. Money would have to be raised perhaps as much as $100,000, and of course Miss Keller would receive a liberal salary, at the very least $50,000. If she had any doubts to begin with, the mention of such a sum would have banished them, for Helen had been troubled for years by the fact that she had done nothing to provide for Annie, in case Annie should survive her. Now there was this opportunity, not only to earn a great deal of money, but to carry a message that burned in her heart. The movie would be called Deliverance. A summary of the plot was put together by Dr. Miller. Financial backing was found. A formal contract was drawn up and signed in May 1918. Both women got $10,000 upon signing, and another $10,000 would be paid when the movie was finished. There were royalties still to come. The next step would be Los Angeles, but before they left, Helen and Annie attended a dinner in honor of the poet Walt Whitman. Helen had been invited to speak. Dr. Miller was there as well, a guest of Helen and Annie, and he heard the speech, in which she deplored the government's persecution of her good friends, the Wobblies. Panic followed. Dr. Miller told Mrs. Macy she had better explain to Helen that such opinions were dangerous. If Helen continued to express them, it was entirely possible that the government, which controlled the railroads under wartime restrictions, might refuse them transportation to Los Angeles. Managers might refuse to let them use theaters. Even if a theater could be found, the public might refuse to look at the picture. In short, Helen had better keep her opinions to herself. For a while she did. Silence was a price she willingly paid for a chance to bring her message to the public. As the dungeon of sense in which I once lay was broken by love and faith, so I desire to open wide all the prison doors of the world. But a few weeks later, Helen was unable to resist joining a group of distinguished educators in a statement to the New Republic demanding a fair trial for the Wobblies. The Justice Department warned the magazine against printing the statement, and Dr. Miller, who was horrified all over again, insisted on a written promise from Helen that she would never behave so indiscreetly in the future. Helen must have given her promise, however, reluctantly, for with Teacher and Polly she set out by train to California, the land where lemon trees grew and where flowers were spread out underfoot like Persian rugs. They met their director, George Platt, a sensitive man with a sound instinct for drama. There was also a Dr. Edwin Liebfried, whom Helen called the man who paid the bills. And there were 2 young actresses, a little girl to play Helen as a child, and another to be Helen at Radcliffe. Helen played herself in the later scenes, which meant following the director's orders. Annie figured out how to do it. First, she or Polly would spell Platt's instructions into Helen's hand, what she would be doing next, what feeling she was supposed to convey while doing it. A series of taps on the floor would then tell her when to begin a particular sequence of the action. Tap, 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 walk toward the window on your right. Tap, 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 hold up your hands to the sun. Helen never felt at ease when acting. She worried about the heat of the studio lights, afraid that her nose and forehead were sweaty. She worried that she couldn't relax, couldn't move easily and comfortably, but she went about her duties as an actress with courage and determination. To George Platt she was a born trooper, and there were times when he could hardly hold back tears as he tapped out, "Be natural," and Helen tried so bravely to portray her own self for the camera. Unfortunately, people on the set were beginning to suspect that this part of the story, after childhood and girlhood, offered very little in the way of suspense. Nothing seemed to happen, at least nothing that showed on the screen, because it took place mostly in Helen's head. Everyone had his own ideas about how to compensate. There was frantic improvisation. Subplots were injected in strong doses of symbolism. In one of them, Helen, the pacifist, was mounted on a large white horse, galloped dangerously forward, while she blew on a brass trumpet. Thousands of extras dressed as shipyard and factory workers ran behind on the way to deliverance. In another, knowledge and ignorance, played by a woman and a man, wrestled for Helen's mind before the cave of Father Time. Great sums of money were spent on these improvised sequences, with Dr. Liebfried, the money man, resisting every inch of the way. They finished filming in December, a month after the armistice that ended the war. Dr. Liebfried then fired everyone and hired Dr. Miller back only when he realized the titles still had to be written, which was Miller's job. The unedited film was screened, Teacher and Dr. Liebfried almost coming to blows about what to leave in and what to take out. Dr. Liebfried wanted a commercial thriller. Teacher and Helen wanted historical truth. The women returned to Forest Hills. Since Dr. Liebfried refused to advance another cent, they had to borrow money from Ned Holmes, the Cambridge friend who lived with them. "I don't remember a time since college days when we were so much up against it," Helen told her mother. But their credit was good, and everyone waited willingly for their money. As Helen explained to a friend, there is no doubt of the success of the picture. The big bidders are bidding against each other for it. Deliverance opened on August 18th at the Lyric Theater on Broadway. According to the New York Times, Miss Keller's life was full of marvels. The cast was excellent, the photography exceptionally good, and the film was one of the triumphs of the motion picture. The Globe found it far more compelling than a love story. The New York World called it a masterpiece. After a month or so on Broadway, the rights were sold to a Chicago distributor who explained some years later that Deliverance was appreciated only by the more refined classes and thinking people, but it did not succeed in drawing crowds to the box office. Nobody made any money on it. Helen and Teacher had nothing more than the first advance, a generous one, but already spent in Hollywood. The dream of riches evaporated, and with it another dream. Facing her 40th birthday, Helen saw that the fantasies were over, that what she called her quaint fancy of leading the people of the world to victory belonged to her youth and the past. Chapter 17. On the Road Again. In the winter of 1920, Helen started a new career, one that some people considered unsuitable, if not degrading. She did it for the money, she explained. Another reason was her belief that the blind would be accepted by the world only if they had work, real work, judged by the same standards as everyone else's. Although she never mentioned it, work served yet another purpose. An active mind has little time or energy left for the long thoughts that turn inward, that question fate and unfairness of life. What Helen did in partnership with Annie was become a vaudeville act. Lecturing had been dignified, but there were few opportunities left on the lecture circuit. The women had only one story to tell. They had told it, and people didn't want to hear it again. Vaudeville was not dignified. It was acrobats, monkeys, trained seals, tap dancers, horses, parrots, Swiss bell ringers, a grab bag of miscellaneous acts that tumbled across hundreds of stages belonging to the Orpheum or Pantages chains. From coast to coast, in small towns and metropolitan centers, this was the nation's most popular form of entertainment. Vaudeville came to the house in Forest Hills by the way of a young musician, George Lewis, who read the reviews of Deliverance and thought Miss Keller might have a chance on stage. He got in touch with a firm of New York theatrical agents and brought them to Forest Hills. It didn't take long for them to agree that Miss Keller would either fill the theaters or empty them. They were ready to bet she would fill them. A 20-minute act was created, a pared-down version of the lecture performance. thoroughly rehearsed. They opened on February 24th, 1920 at the Palace Theater in Manhattan, before an audience as nervous as the actors. The curtain rose on teacher seated at a grand piano, a full spotlight flooding her face and upper body. She was in a drawing room, a fireplace with a crackling fire to one side, the piano with a large vase of flowers on it to the other side, and velvet hangings in the background. Teacher addressed the audience in her soft voice with its musical Irish brogue. She explained how she came to Tuscumbia and how Helen went on to Radcliffe and wrote books, and what her famous friends had to say about her. She quoted Mark Twain. The two greatest characters in the 19th century are Napoleon and Helen Keller. The orchestra played Felix Mendelssohn's Spring Song. Helen's cue to enter. Polly, waiting behind the velvet curtains with Helen, gave her a nudge. Helen then parted the curtain and walked out. She was tall, slim, still attractive, and as always elegantly dressed. Floor-length dresses with elaborate beadwork were favorites of both Helen and Annie. She shuffled a bit at first when moving along beside the piano. A reporter noted the troubled hush in the audience as they watched a blind woman walking about on her own, possibly headed for the edge of the stage with the orchestra pit below. Did she know how close it was? But as soon as Helen reached the piano and the vase of flowers, she stopped, lifted her head, sniffed, then buried her face in the flowers. This was Annie's cue to come forward and lead Helen front and center. Together they went through the story of the miracle, the day when Annie spelled water into Helen's hands, and the child suddenly knew that everything had a name. They went on to show how Helen had learned speech, and ended with Helen saying, "I am not dumb any more. I am not dumb now." People found that strange, laboring voice tremendously moving. Then there was a brief question period. Knowing the questions would be much the same as those she got on the lecture circuit, Helen had worked out a list of the likeliest ones and memorized answers. Some were humorous, others sarcastic. There were also times when she said exactly what was on her mind with stunning candor. What did America gain by the war? The American Legion and a bunch of other troubles. Who are the three greatest men of our time? Lenin, Edison, and Charlie Chaplin. Do you think any government wants peace? The policy of governments is to seek peace and pursue war. Before she had been on the stage 2 minutes, the Tribune critic wrote the following day, "Helen Keller has conquered again. In the Monday afternoon audience at the Palace, one of the most critical and cynical in the world was hers." The act was held over for a second week, then went on to Baltimore and Pittsburgh. There was criticism from friends as well as strangers. Some people wondered how Helen could bear to share a stage with animals and acrobats. Helen's mother, according to Annie, would rather have been chopped into little bits than see her daughter in vaudeville, and one old friend assumed Helen never knew about the other act, that she was being used, manipulated by unscrupulous people. If the old friend imagined the manipulating was done by Annie, she was much mistaken, for Annie never liked vaudeville, never adjusted to backstage life, with clowns, seals, and tap dancers for company. She hated the quarrels, jealousies, and pettiness that are to be found in every profession, Helen said, and she didn't think much of the audiences. They were ordinary, their questions seemed idiotic, and this was not the kind of setting Annie wanted for Helen. It was also true that the footlights were painful to her eyes, while the noise and the constant rush tore at her nerves. She caught respiratory ailments, laryngitis or bronchitis, one after the other, and was apt to stumble unless Polly walked by her side. A few newspapers commented on how weary she seemed. Helen, by contrast, was having a wonderful time. "I like to feel the warm tide of human life pulsing round and round me," she said. "I like to weep at its sorrows, to be annoyed at its foibles, to laugh at its absurdities." She was welcomed into the workshops where actors kept their costumes and cosmetics. Charming bits of acts were performed for her there, the costumes held up so her hands could examine them. People told her their personal histories, described their heartaches as well as the wild parties they had been to. It meant a great deal to her to be accepted in this way, to belong, to be part of things. A performer by the name of Will Cressy, who wrote a column for the New York Star, left a portrait of Helen Keller during her vaudeville days. There she sits in that invisible steel cell of hers, alone in all the universe, and yet she is as lonely as I think she is. 1,000 different expressions are chasing each other over her face. Her head is perched to one side as if she was listening, and yet she cannot hear. Her great big wide open beautiful eyes are continually shifting around, as if she was looking for something, and yet she cannot see. But yet in some mysterious way she senses many things. Let anyone walk by that she has grown to know, and she learns to recognize them as quickly as she does everything else, and she will look up and smile. She recognizes the vibration of their footsteps. If there is dancing going on the stage, she is beating time, smiling and weaving back and forth from side to side in time with the music. And always she is smiling. There may be quicker-witted people somewhere in the world than this same Miss Helen Keller, but if there are, I have never met them. While Will Cressy was observing her, Helen observed her audience, but in her own way. "Before I say a word, I feel its breath as it comes in little pulsations to my face," she said. She knew when the house was packed, when the audience applauded, laughed, or fell silent. She knew it when it was mostly men because of the strong odor of tobacco. Carpenters smelled of wood, doctors brought the smell of sick rooms, and either druggists smelled like drugs. They felt protective toward her, just as Will Cressy did, and she must have known that too. One evening in November of 1921 they were in Los Angeles on a second-year-long tour. Helen had a telegram from Mildred saying their mother had died. The news came 2 hours before she was due to go on stage, but she did go on, believing that her private grief was not the audience's fault. One of the questions asked me that day was, "How old are you?" How old indeed! I felt as old as time. Another question was, "Are you happy?" I swallowed hard and answered, "Yes, because I have confidence in God." Then it was over, and for a little while I could sit alone with my sorrow. In recent years she and her mother had grown closer, especially when they traveled together on lecture tours or vaudeville, and this closeness must have consoled Helen for whatever guilt she felt in needing Annie more than she needed her mother. In the winter, soon after their return to Forest Hills, Helen learned that Dr. Bell had died. One by one the people she loved were tiptoeing off stage. She knew she would meet them all again, in the great beyond where all truth shines revealed. But there were gaping blanks left in her life, and some panic when she understood from others how old her teacher looked.